Joe Martinez, a 34-year-old union plumber and father of 2 young children, thought his biggest challenge was making the mortgage payments on the first home his family had ever owned. Then Beverly Richardson knocked on his door at 7:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, demanding he remove his work van from his own driveway immediately or face immediate towing. What unfolded over the next 6 months would test everything he believed about hard work, community belonging, and the American dream of homeownership. Before this story begins, consider how well you really know the difference between following rules and being targeted for who you are. This happened just 18 months ago in a middle-class subdivision outside Phoenix, Arizona. The Martinez family still lives there today, and their story changed how dozens of working families view their place in suburban America. Joe had saved for 7 years to buy the modest 3-bedroom ranch house on Maple Street in Sunset Hills, a planned community built in 2018 with neat sidewalks, small front yards, and CC&R rules that promised to protect property values for all residents. Every dollar of the down payment had come from overtime shifts, weekend emergency calls, and Maria's extra nursing shifts at the hospital. When they finally got the keys, Joe stood in the driveway holding his 2 children's hands, looking at the house with its beige stucco walls and red tile roof, feeling like he had achieved something his immigrant parents never thought possible for their son. The work van was a 2019 Ford Transit, white with Martinez Plumbing, licensed and insured lettered on the sides along with his contractor's license number. It was spotlessly maintained, necessary for his business, and represented 12 years of building a reputation for honest work and fair prices throughout the Phoenix metro area. Joe parked it in his own driveway every night, the same way his neighbors parked their sedans, SUVs, and pickup trucks. The van contained thousands of dollars worth of specialized tools, pipes, fittings, and equipment that couldn't be left unsecured overnight. More than that, it represented his identity as a skilled craftsman who took pride in solving problems that kept families' homes functioning properly. For the first 8 months of home ownership, life in Sunset Hills felt like the suburban dream Joe had worked toward. Sophia and Diego rode their bikes on the sidewalks. Maria planted flowers in the small front garden, and Joe waved to neighbors while loading his van each morning at 6 a.m. He was careful to avoid blocking anyone's view, never parked on the street during peak hours, and always kept his driveway and garage area neat and organized. The van fit completely within his driveway boundaries, harming no one and following what he understood to be the neighborhood's practical approach to residential parking. Beverly Richardson had served on the Sunset Hills Homeowners Association board for 12 years, the last 6 as chair of the Architectural Review Committee. At 58, she was a retired insurance executive who had moved to Arizona from Connecticut after her divorce, bringing with her definite ideas about property values, neighborhood aesthetics, and the type of residents who belonged in quality subdivisions. Her own home was one of the larger models in the development, with professional landscaping, a 3-car garage, and a circular driveway where she parked her silver Mercedes sedan. Beverly spent considerable time each day walking through the neighborhood, noting violations, taking photographs, and maintaining detailed files on every property that didn't meet her standards for suburban excellence. The knock on Joe's door that Tuesday morning came as he was finishing his coffee and preparing for a day of service calls. Beverly stood on his front porch in her exercise clothes and running shoes, holding a clipboard, and wearing the expression of someone who had discovered a serious problem requiring immediate attention. She identified herself as the HOA Architectural Review Committee chair and informed Joe that his commercial vehicle was in violation of Section 4.3 of the community's CC&Rs, which prohibited the parking of commercial vehicles in residential driveways overnight. Joe listened with growing confusion and concern as Beverly explained that multiple neighbors had complained about his work van, that it was negatively impacting property values throughout their section of the development, and that he had exactly 48 hours to make alternative parking arrangements or face immediate towing at his own expense. When Joe asked who had complained and why no one had ever mentioned this to him directly, Beverly replied that the complaints were confidential but numerous, and that ignorance of the rules was not an acceptable excuse for ongoing violations. Standing in his doorway looking at this woman he had never seen before, who was now threatening to have his work vehicle towed from his own property, Joe felt the first stirring of an anxiety that would grow into something much larger over the coming months. He had read the CC&Rs before purchasing, or thought he had, and didn't Remember, any restrictions on work vehicles parked on private property. His real estate agent had assured him there were no unusual limitations that would affect a working family, and his mortgage lender had required HOA document review as part of the approval process. Yet here was an official board member telling him his livelihood was unwelcome in his own driveway. After Beverly left, Joe immediately retrieved his CC&R documents and began reading through the dense legal language more carefully than he had during the hectic home buying process. Section 4.3 did indeed restrict commercial vehicles from overnight parking in residential areas, but the definition was vague and seemed to focus on large trucks, equipment trailers, and obvious business operations, rather than standard work vans used by individual contractors. Joe's van was hardly larger than many of the pickup trucks and SUVs parked throughout the neighborhood, and certainly less conspicuous than some of the recreational vehicles he had noticed in other driveways. More troubling was Joe's discovery that the rules seemed selectively enforced. Walking through Sunset Hills that evening after dinner, he documented 3 RVs, 2 boat trailers, a classic car restoration project taking up an entire driveway, and several pickup trucks with business decals that appeared to violate the same regulations Beverly claimed were being strictly enforced. Mrs. Henderson on Oak Street had her husband's pest control truck parked prominently in their driveway every night, complete with chemical tank and spray equipment. The Johnsons 2 streets over had a landscaping trailer that had been parked in the same spot for months, growing weeds around its wheels. When Joe called the HOA management company the next morning to discuss the situation, he was transferred to an assistant who seemed familiar with his case. She explained that the Architectural Review Committee had received multiple complaints about his vehicle and that he needed to comply with the notice immediately to avoid escalation. When Joe asked about the apparent selective enforcement and requested copies of any complaints filed against his van, he was told that complaint records were confidential, and that committee decisions were final unless appealed through the formal dispute resolution process. The appeal process required a $500 non-refundable fee, written documentation of his position, and a hearing before the full board that wouldn't be scheduled for at least 6 weeks. During that time, Joe would be expected to comply with the original order or face daily fines of $100 plus potential legal action for continued violations. For a working father already stretched thin by mortgage payments and the costs of establishing his business, the financial pressure was immediate and overwhelming. Joe's attempts to find alternative parking solutions revealed just how difficult and expensive it would be to accommodate Beverly's demands. Commercial storage facilities with security adequate for his tools and equipment cost between $300 and $500 per month, not including the daily inconvenience of traveling to retrieve his van each morning and return it each evening. Renting garage space from other residents was prohibited by the same CC&R sections that Beverly was using to target his driveway parking. Taking the van to his office location wasn't possible because his plumbing business operated from his home, a perfectly legal arrangement that many contractors use to minimize overhead and keep prices competitive for their customers. The stress began affecting Joe's entire family almost immediately. Maria noticed her husband having trouble sleeping, waking up at 4 a.m. to check that his van was still in the driveway, worrying about the mounting legal and financial pressures that seemed to be coming from nowhere. Sophia asked why Daddy looked so tired all the time, and Diego wanted to know if they were going to have to move away from their house like his friend Tommy had when his parents got divorced. The children couldn't understand why their father's work truck, which they associated with his ability to fix things and help people, had suddenly become a problem that was making everyone in the family worry about losing their home. Joe's union representative, Frank Sullivan, had 25 years of experience helping skilled tradesmen navigate workplace discrimination and legal challenges that specifically targeted working-class families. When Joe explained his situation, Frank immediately recognized the pattern of what he called economic discrimination disguised as aesthetic enforcement. Frank had seen similar cases throughout the Phoenix area, where middle-class subdivisions used HOA rules to gradually exclude working families whose visible connection to blue-collar employment was deemed incompatible with suburban property values. The research Frank conducted into Sunset Hills HOA enforcement patterns revealed exactly what Joe suspected, but had been afraid to investigate on his own. Over the past 3 years, the Architectural Review Committee had filed formal complaints against 12 different residents for various vehicle violations, but 11 of those cases involved work trucks, contractor, vans, or other vehicles associated with blue-collar employment. The single non-work-related violation involved a recreational vehicle that was resolved with a warning after the owner agreed to install screening vegetation. During that same period, the HOA had ignored dozens of clear violations involving luxury recreational vehicles, classic car collections, and other expensive toys belonging to residents whose economic status was more acceptable to the board's vision of community standards. Beverly Richardson's own next-door neighbor had been parking a 35-foot Class A motorhome in his driveway for 18 months completely, blocking sightlines and taking up space that dwarfed Joe's work van, yet no complaints had been filed and no enforcement action had been taken. Frank's investigation also revealed that Beverly had been systematically targeting working families since joining the board, using her position to file complaints against a house painter, an electrician, a lawn care business owner, and 2 other plumbers who had eventually moved out of the development, rather than fight the mounting legal pressure. Each case had followed the same pattern: sudden enforcement of vaguely written rules, selective application that ignored similar violations by wealthier residents, escalating financial pressure designed to force compliance or departure, and formal procedures that heavily favored the HOA's position through expensive and time-consuming appeals processes. The union's involvement changed the dynamics of Joe's case in ways that Beverly Richardson had not anticipated when she began her campaign to remove his work van from the neighborhood. Frank Sullivan understood that this was bigger than one family's parking dispute. It was part of a broader pattern of communities using HOA governance to exclude working families who had legitimately earned their place in middle-class subdivisions, but whose visible connection to manual labor was considered incompatible with certain residents' vision of suburban respectability. Frank began by filing a formal complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which regulated HOA operations throughout the state, alleging selective enforcement and discriminatory application of community rules based on the economic class and employment status of targeted residents. The complaint included detailed documentation of the enforcement disparities Frank had discovered, photographs showing tolerated violations by non-working class residents, and correspondence demonstrating the pattern of harassment directed specifically at blue-collar homeowners. Simultaneously, Frank arranged for Joe to receive free legal representation through the union's legal services program, which specialized in protecting working families from various forms of employment and housing discrimination. The attorney, Sarah Chen, had extensive experience with HOA disputes and immediately recognized that Joe's case represented a clear violation of fair housing principles, even though the discrimination was based on economic class rather than the more traditional protected categories. Sarah's legal research uncovered several important facts that strengthened Joe's position considerably. First, Arizona state law explicitly protected homeowners' right to park legally registered vehicles on their own private property, provided they weren't violating specific safety or environmental regulations. Second, the CC&R language that Beverly was using to justify her enforcement action was sufficiently vague to be potentially unenforceable under state consumer protection statutes that required homeowner obligations to be clearly defined and reasonably applied. Most importantly, Sarah discovered that the Sunset Hills HOA had never formally adopted the enforcement procedures that Beverly claimed gave her authority to order immediate towing of residents' vehicles. The community's governing documents required board votes on significant enforcement actions, written notice periods of at least 30 days, and opportunities for residents to address violations before facing financial penalties. Beverly had been operating essentially as a one-person enforcement committee, making decisions that exceeded her actual authority and creating legal liability for the HOA that could expose them to significant financial damages if Joe decided to pursue his rights aggressively. Armed with this legal ammunition, Sarah sent a comprehensive response to the HOA's towing threat that detailed Joe's position and made clear that any attempt to remove his vehicle from his private property would result in immediate legal action for conversion, trespass, and violation of his rights under Arizona homeowner protection statutes. The letter also demanded that the HOA provide documentation of the complaints that Beverly claimed had been filed, proof of the board authorization for her enforcement actions, and evidence that the same standards were being applied equally to all residents regardless of their employment or economic status. The HOA's attorney response revealed just how weak Beverly's position actually was from a legal standpoint. After reviewing the case, the association's legal counsel advised that the enforcement action should be suspended pending a full board review of the community's vehicle policies and their application. The attorney noted that the selective enforcement pattern Frank had documented created significant legal liability for the HOA and recommended that all vehicle-related complaints be reviewed to ensure consistent application of community standards. This legal victory provided Joe with temporary relief from the immediate towing threat, but it also escalated the personal conflict with Beverly Richardson in ways that made daily life in Sunset Hills increasingly uncomfortable for the Martinez family. Beverly's response to being overruled by her own HOA's legal counsel was to intensify her scrutiny of Joe's property and behavior, looking for new violations she could use to continue her campaign to drive him from the neighborhood. Over the following weeks, Joe received a series of violation notices for increasingly minor issues. His garbage cans were allegedly visible from the street for more than the permitted hours on collection day. His children's bicycles were said to be improperly stored on the front porch, and his lawn was claimed to exceed the maximum allowable grass height by a fraction of an inch. Each violation carried potential fines and required time-consuming responses that were clearly designed to create ongoing harassment rather than address legitimate community concerns. The psychological pressure of living under constant surveillance and criticism began taking a serious toll on Joe's family relationships and mental health. Maria found herself checking and rechecking every aspect of their property maintenance, worried that any small oversight would provide Beverly with new ammunition to use against them. The children became anxious about playing in their own front yard, aware that the woman who walked by their house multiple times each day was looking for reasons to get their family in trouble. Joe's work performance began suffering as he found himself distracted by worry about what new violation notice might be waiting when he returned home each evening. Several longtime customers commented that he seemed stressed and asked if everything was okay at home, forcing Joe to explain that his family was being harassed by their homeowners association in ways that made him question whether homeownership had been worth the sacrifices they had made to achieve it. The turning point came when Beverly made a crucial strategic error that revealed the true nature of her motivations and provided Joe with the evidence he needed to defend his family effectively. During a community board meeting that Joe attended to observe the HOA's decision-making process, Beverly presented what she called a neighborhood beautification initiative that would upgrade the community's vehicle standards to better reflect property values and resident quality. Beverly's presentation included photographs of various vehicles parked throughout Sunset Hills with commentary about their impact on community aesthetics and property values. The photographs clearly showed that she had been conducting systematic surveillance of working residents while ignoring similar or worse violations by wealthier homeowners. Her language during the presentation revealed attitudes about economic class and manual labor that went far beyond legitimate concerns about community standards. When Beverly described Joe's work van as the type of commercial vehicle that attracts the wrong element to quality residential communities, she exposed the discriminatory mindset that had been driving her enforcement actions from the beginning. Her suggestion that the community needed to be more selective about the kinds of residents and businesses we want representing our neighborhood made clear that her real objection wasn't to vehicles per se, but to the visible evidence that working class families had earned their place in suburban middle-class communities. Several longtime residents who had previously remained neutral in Joe's conflict with Beverly were visibly uncomfortable with the classist implications of her presentation. When one board member asked whether the new standards would apply equally to all residents, Beverly's response made clear that recreational vehicles, luxury cars, and hobby-related equipment would receive different treatment than commercial vehicles used by working residents, even if the visual impact and space requirements were identical. Joe's decision to record Beverly's presentation on his phone, with permission from the board chair, provided his legal team with powerful evidence of discriminatory intent that transformed his case from a simple HOA dispute into a potential civil rights violation with significant legal consequences for both Beverly personally and the association as a whole. Sarah Chen immediately recognized that Beverly's recorded comments provided grounds for federal fair housing complaints based on economic discrimination and disparate impact on working families. The union's political connections also proved valuable in bringing broader attention to Joe's case as an example of how HOA governance could be used to exclude working families from communities they had legitimately earned the right to join. Frank Sullivan arranged for a local television news team to interview Joe about his experience, framing the story as part of a broader pattern of discrimination against skilled tradesmen and other blue-collar workers who were being systematically excluded from suburban communities despite having stable employment and strong family values. The television coverage of Joe's story resonated powerfully with working families throughout the Phoenix area who had experienced similar discrimination or feared they might face comparable treatment if they tried to move into HOA-governed communities. The news segment generated hundreds of supportive phone calls and emails, many from other tradesmen who shared their own stories of being made to feel unwelcome in neighborhoods where their work skills had literally built the infrastructure that made suburban life possible. More importantly, the media attention brought Joe's case to the attention of state legislators who had been considering reforms to Arizona as HOA regulations in response to growing complaints about abuse of homeowner rights by poorly supervised community associations. Joe's story provided a concrete example of how existing laws were inadequate to protect working families from economic discrimination, disguised as aesthetic enforcement, and it generated political pressure for stronger oversight of HOA governance practices. The combination of legal pressure, media attention, and political scrutiny created a situation where Beverly Richardson's position on the HOA board became increasingly untenable. Several major homebuilders who developed properties in the Phoenix area expressed concern that discriminatory enforcement practices could expose them to legal liability and damage their reputation with working-class buyers who represented a significant portion of their customer base. The HOA's insurance carrier also began asking questions about the association's potential liability for discriminatory enforcement practices that could result in expensive legal judgments. Beverly's response to this mounting pressure was to double down on her position, insisting that she was simply enforcing community standards that all residents had agreed to follow when they purchased their homes. Her increasingly strident communications to other board members and HOA management reflected a person who felt her authority and vision for the community were being undermined by outside forces that didn't understand the importance of maintaining property values through consistent enforcement of quality standards. The final confrontation came during a specially called HOA board meeting to address Joe's formal complaint about discriminatory enforcement and to review the association's vehicle policies for potential revision. Beverly had clearly expected to control the meeting and use it to justify her enforcement actions, but the presence of union representatives, legal counsel, media observers, and dozens of concerned residents created a very different dynamic than she had anticipated. Joe's presentation of his case was measured, factual, and focused on documenting the pattern of selective enforcement that had targeted him and other working residents while ignoring similar or worse violations by wealthier homeowners. He presented photographs, enforcement records, and legal analysis that made clear this was not about legitimate community standards but about using HOA governance to exclude families whose visible connection to blue-collar work was deemed incompatible with certain residents' vision of suburban respectability. The board's review of Beverly's enforcement history revealed a pattern of personal bias and procedural violations that exposed the HOA to significant legal liability. Not only had she exceeded her authority in threatening immediate towing, but her selective enforcement practices violated the association's own governing documents and created potential federal civil rights violations. The pattern of targeting working families while ignoring comparable violations by wealthier residents constituted exactly the type of discriminatory conduct that fair housing laws were designed to prevent. When the board voted unanimously to suspend all pending vehicle-related enforcement actions pending a comprehensive review of community policies, Beverly's reaction revealed the depth of her personal investment in maintaining control over who belonged in Sunset Hills. Her angry outburst about lowering community standards to accommodate people who don't understand property values provided additional evidence of the discriminatory attitudes that had motivated her campaign against Joe and other working families. The board's subsequent vote to censure Beverly for exceeding her authority and violating the association's non-discrimination policies effectively ended her ability to continue targeting residents based on their employment or economic status. Her resignation from the board 2 weeks later came after several major developers threatened to withdraw their financial support from community events and amenities if the HOA continued to engage in practices that discriminated against working families. The resolution of Joe's case included several important victories that went beyond his immediate family's situation. The HOA adopted new vehicle policies that applied consistent standards to all residents regardless of the purpose or commercial nature of their vehicles, provided they met basic safety and registration requirements. The association also implemented oversight procedures that required board approval for significant enforcement actions, and created an independent appeals process to protect residents from individual board members' personal biases. Most importantly for Joe's family, the settlement agreement included written acknowledgement that his work van had never violated any legitimate community standards, formal apology from the HOA for the harassment he had experienced, and reimbursement of all legal costs and fees associated with defending his right to park his vehicle on his own property. The agreement also included provisions that prohibited any board member or HOA employee from retaliating against the Martinez family for pursuing their legal rights. The changes Beverly's discriminatory enforcement had forced Joe to make in his business operations were minimal and ultimately beneficial. The documentation he had been required to maintain for his legal defense helped him organize his record-keeping and tax preparation more efficiently. The media attention his case had generated resulted in several new customers who specifically wanted to support a contractor who had stood up for working families' rights in suburban communities. Joe's children learned important lessons about standing up for what's right even when facing pressure from people with authority and different economic resources. Sophia and Diego both wrote school reports about their father's courage in fighting discrimination, and they developed a deeper understanding of the dignity and value of skilled manual labor that would influence their own career choices and social attitudes throughout their lives. The broader impact of Joe's case extended well beyond Sunset Hills to influence HOA governance practices throughout Arizona and other states where similar discrimination against working families had been occurring. Several state legislatures passed stronger protections for homeowners facing discriminatory enforcement, and federal housing agencies began paying closer attention to economic discrimination disguised as aesthetic enforcement in residential communities. For Joe Martinez, the resolution of his HOA conflict represented more than just the right to park his work van in his own driveway. It affirmed his family's place in the American middle class and validated the dignity of honest work that builds and maintains the infrastructure that makes suburban life possible. When he pulls into his driveway each evening after a day of helping families solve their plumbing problems, he sees not just his house but his family's achievement and their rightful place in a community that has learned to welcome the diversity of honest work that makes neighborhoods function. The Martinez family's story demonstrates that the American dream of homeownership must include room for the families whose skilled labor literally builds the communities where that dream becomes reality. Joe's courage in fighting for his family's rights created positive change that protected not just his own children's future but the opportunities of countless other working families who deserve to feel welcome in the neighborhoods their contributions have helped create. Beverly Richardson eventually moved to a different community, one with more restrictive covenants that better matched her vision of suburban homogeneity. The Sunset Hills neighborhood has become more inclusive and welcoming under new leadership that recognizes the value of residents from diverse economic backgrounds who contribute their skills, stability, and family values to creating genuine community rather than artificial exclusivity. If this situation unfolded in your neighborhood, would you find the courage to stand up like Joe Martinez did? Sometimes protecting what matters most requires us to discover strength we never knew we had, and to recognize that our differences in occupation and income are far less important than our shared values of hard work, family dedication, and treating others with dignity and respect. The most valuable neighborhoods aren't those that exclude honest working families, but those that welcome the diversity of skills and perspectives.